On today's episode, we're talking all about employee experience and the future of work.
From Engagement, I'm David Millay, and this is Flip the Switch.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Flip the Switch, where we sit down with leaders in customer experience and employee experience, and we try to figure out what are the trends that they're paying attention to? What are the experiments that they're running? What are the principles that have guided success for them throughout their career? Then we take all those things and we apply them to the world of sports and entertainment. And today we are sitting down with Paul Millard. Paul wrote a book called The Pathless Path, Imagining a New Story for Work and Life. So we are going to be geared all up towards talking about employee experience and the future of work. Paul is a really interesting dude where he had been working for big consulting firms, making great money, but just didn't love what his life design was like outside. So based on a lot of the similar things that have inspired me, honestly, and a lot of my stuff around life design and really creating work-life balance that lets you achieve all your goals personally as well as professionally, Paul left that consulting space and went out to basically make his own path, that pathless path. And I think a lot of your employees who are leaving and you're saying, where are they going? This is what they're doing. They're realizing that there can be a better life. It's not always easy. You probably end up working a lot more. I can say that from my own testament. Paul share that as well. But sometimes it's more enjoyable for a certain person. And so I think when we think about this episode, it's going to be great for you if you've got people that have left and you don't understand why they would leave their full-time paying job to go explore and experiment and go do something else and not know where that next paycheck comes from. This will give you a little bit of perspective as to why those employees are leaving. And hopefully it gives you some ideas as to what you can do to help retain that employee for longer and get more out of that person and ultimately help fulfill their life and keep them employed at the job that they're in. So Paul's got a lot of great things. We're going to put his contacts in the show notes as to where you could follow him, but he's got a great podcast called Reimagine Work. And again, his book is called The Pathless Path if you want to get a better understanding on this perspective. Without further ado, let's jump into this episode with Paul Millard. Paul, welcome to the show.
Excited to be here, David.
I am excited to jump in on this episode with you to really talk about employee experience and what is going on in the world, in the industry, help some of our senior leaders in the industry understand from a different point of view what they're up against and what they need to do to really kind of turn Great Resignation into the Great Attraction. So for our listeners who might be unfamiliar with your story, kind of give us a brief background on moving from the corporate world to self-employment and really what led you to write The Pathless Path.
Sure, yeah. So it's a long journey. I think high level cliff notes are I grew up, was always a good student, and went to a public school in Connecticut, University of Connecticut, kind of caught the prestige bug of wanting to break into strategy consulting, figured out how to break into that industry, really liked it, learned a lot of valuable skills. Over time, I realized I wasn't one of those people. And this emerging creative impulse kind of started to blossom and grow. And along with that, I started basically questioning why are our beliefs about how work works and how our lives are supposed to work so disconnected from what I'm experiencing? And as I quit my job in 2017, I started exploring these questions and also experimenting in my own life, talking to hundreds of people from around the world, and just published a book called The Pathless Path, which is my pitch for imagining a new story for how we think about work and life. So yeah, excited to dive into that and talk about what that means for organizations, what that means for works, and what I've been experiencing in my own life.
One of the concepts that I've heard you talk about before is like this concept of wonder being what kind of leads you to quitting. And when you think about your time strategy consulting in your typical corporate world, and when you think about the pathless path, is it you're a reimagination of what work can be. Talk a little bit about that concept of when an employee starts wondering and thinking about what else there could be, that's typically when they end up leaving and quitting. Talk to us a little bit about that concept.
Wonder is a basic human capacity, right? We all have the ability to do it. I think a lack of wonder is what kind of kept me on my previous path for a long time. I was in business school and telling people, oh, this isn't the most important thing in the world, but I had no conception for any other possible way of life. Everything I was doing and all the people I was surrounded by were all very focused on work and as the center of their life and focusing on ambitious career paths. So wonder, what I've seen, is really the thing that for me tipped the scales to make it attractive to take an uncertain path. Right now, a lot of people don't want to leave their jobs because you're basically trading a known discomfort. Even if you don't like your job, it's comfortable. You know that discomfort. You've figured out how to cope with it. Um, and you're not going to trade that for uncertain discomfort, right? Feeling bad or weird or disconnected in ways you can't even predict. There's infinite downside in our brains, the way we think about risk. However, if you start meeting people, if you start traveling to different places that expand your imagination for the possibilities of your life, you start asking these questions. Ooh, there might be interesting things I'll discover along the way. This is what's happened to me. I've had many people tell me this is the same thing they've experienced. And all of a sudden, the uncertain discomfort is like, yes, but I might discover really interesting and cool things along the way. I mean, I think anyone can tap into the power of this. It doesn't have to be to take an uncertain path in the work sense. It can be in any aspect of your life, trying a new thing, right? We're often afraid to try new things. Like if we want to start writing or creating or painting, we have these voices. What if somebody makes fun of us? What if all these bad things? Well, what if you also discover something about yourself that leads you in a really interesting direction?
You've got to be a Tim Ferriss guy. Right? Am I right in that or no?
Podcast.
Because there's a lot of these concepts. Okay,
Yeah, so podcasts were a huge part of my journey of expanding my imagination and the possibilities for my life. I don't know where I'd be now if I hadn't discovered podcasts. I was always an early podcast fan, like hardcore Bill Simmons and like Boston sports fan.
Oh
So
yeah.
it was very early on podcasts, probably like 2010. But then Tim Ferriss, I think, really expanded the awareness of podcasts, especially for like very driven people that are drawn to like more self-development stuff. And he started interviewing all these people living different lives. I discovered other podcasts and ideas from that, and it really excited me. He also exposed me to health ideas. I was just recovering from a chronic illness of like a really bad case of Lyme disease. And the things I was discovering through podcasts like worked and made me feel better and helped me recover from being sick. So I had all these ideas flowing into my brain that were making my life better. And yeah, it really helped explode my own imagination.
Well, the reason why I asked that is specifically around there's an activity that he did that when I was thinking about quitting Disney and going to start my own thing called fear setting, right? And which is talking about this unknown, the fear of the unknown and what's out there, and we don't want to do that, and so we're fine to sit in the discomfort and use our coping mechanisms that we have. Where fear setting is very similar, it's a similar exercise to what you explained, which is basically saying, what if I
Right.
jump out and do those things? What's the absolute worst case scenario of that things that we can do? And the reality is they're not that those fears are not that bad when you actually sit down and you list them of like, what would happen if I were to quit my job? What would happen if I were to go take this risk?
Yeah, and I write this in my book. I share how I used his exercise, fear setting. Um, and one powerful thing is, what steps would you need to take to get back to where you are today? Typically, it's like an email to an old boss and just asking for your job back. But the powerful part of that exercise is like, what are the costs of inaction? Right. So it makes you look at your current state and say, what costs am I incurring by continuing along this existing path? And it kind of flips the script to saying, oh, there might be benefits of trying something, and it might be better than some of the costs you're incurring now by not doing anything. Because we often don't assess our current state as having any risks. We only assess different states in the future as having risks.
All right. So, Paul, switching gears a little bit, one of the chapters that really stood out to us in the Pathless Path was providing some clarity and data, particularly around the economic anomaly of our parents and grandparents that they experienced to demonstrate why it's not worth it anymore. Can you share some of the research that you discovered on the imbalance between kind of work ethic and meeting needs of our lives?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic. I think the way I frame it in my book is you kind of have the default path, right? And that's what I position the pathless path, kind of this unconventional embrace of uncertainty path, as opposed to the default path. The default path is basically the socially accepted path in your culture. Almost
Hmm.
everyone knows what this is. Like in the US, it's go to school, get good grades, get a good job, and then huge question mark, but we kind of just ignore that. Um, like all sorts of uncertain, like people have to navigate all sort of different challenges in their careers these days. But yeah, that's the default path. Like basically get a paycheck and just keep doing that. Um, now that works still incredibly well for many people. And
For sure.
like when it was established after World War II in the United States and in other Western countries, and now in many countries across the world, it still works exceptionally well. But back in the 50s through 2000, a lot of these countries had economic growth, which is far beyond what we're experiencing now. Growth rates of like 10, 15% in some industries. What that means is you're basically just getting thrown into more interesting and more interesting roles, right? So we've sort of stagnated, and many industries have slowed unless you're in technology. And we're still living with the hangover of the scripts and stories of like how work should be, right? So you can't just
No
show up
question.
at a company and kind of just get like glide your way to the top. The more common stories, like you sort of just get stuck in a mid-level position at a company and kind of just start like hang out there forever. And so the people that are aware of this are starting companies. They're joining smaller firms. They're joining the tech industry. But a lot of people are still living with these scripts of like, here's how things should be. But they're not matching up to like what they're experiencing.
Yeah. I think that in the sports space, particularly, that narrative runs deep because I think that the industry that most of our listeners are coming from, sports and entertainment, is this is so ingrained, this script of you go into a department, you work there, you work your way up, you bounce from team to team, take a diagonal path. That's how the guy that is that senior leader who's been there for 50 years and in the industry, that's the advice that they're giving down of the best way to succeed. And so it's just feeding this narrative that this is the way to do it. I remember for me sitting down with one of the best athletic directors in the country coming out of college, and I was like, hey, I think I want to be an athletic director. What should my path be? And he's like, you got to start working out in an athletic department right away. And I was like, well, that seems really counterintuitive if you're telling me that at the rate of change that has
Right.
happened since your time, right? Like, and you're in your 60s, that the best path for me is just to stay in a department and be in a department my whole life.
Right.
Like, how is that going to infuse any type of innovation into the industry? How am I going to grow from that? And like, that was the advice. That was his genuine advice that he gave. And so I totally took a different path and have kind of cobbled this together and where we are now.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't interrogate their relationship to work, why they believe what they're believing. A thing I often do with people is just ask them, what is work? And then they get really flustered because they might come up with a quick answer, but then they realize, I don't really know what I define as work. Right.
Yeah. I'm trying to think like if I'm defining that for myself, like I would probably define it as like for me now at this point, it's like I would define it as creative output. Like what is something that I can wake up and be and create and put out into the world. But that's how I define work. And I've gone through some of these same exercises that you've gone through.
Right.
Like What's the typical answer you get when you ask that question?
A lot of people say, I don't know, but what they're doing by that is admitting I haven't interrogated this question and I'm sort of accepting the default script of society, which I think is basically paid employment with a salary, right?
It makes sense.
When you see
Yeah.
a parent staying home with their kids and opting out of work, that's what people say. Oh, they're choosing to stay home. That the default is paid employment. So we all,
Facts.
and so this is a really deep story and script. And I think part one is just like realizing this exists. Now, embracing something like creative output or like what I would say is work is like basically the things worth doing, like super broad.
That is really broad.
But
But it also eliminates a lot of stuff in our daily employment that we
But
have.
what I'm saying is like I don't see monetizing every action I do as like the prime aim of life, which means I'm not optimizing for that, which makes people uncomfortable because whether people want to believe it or not, we live in a society which puts work almost at the center of life. So
Yeah.
challenging these scripts, right? So like some of these stories paired with that are like that work should be painful, right? So this is a this is a deep story that comes from like even religious beliefs. Like you can trace this to
I
the
was just about to
you
get
can
into this.
trace
Yeah.
this to the Bible, like that thou who does not suffer shall not eat, right? So this has gotten absorbed into our Puritan ethic, like Catholic work ethic, and kind of like muddled in this idea of like you need to put in your time, you need to struggle, you need to like pay your dues. Um, which was great when you joined the sports industries in the 80s and 90s and there were like 100 people working in the industry, right? And like you were
Right.
about
Right.
to take off on an exponential trajectory, like suffering and putting in your time basically looked like unlimited upside and economic success.
Right. Right.
Right. But that story, if you're a young person and you put that as like the prime script you're going to run your head, you're just going to end up frustrated and stuck. Senior leaders at these organizations that are like, this is the way it was in my day, all they're doing is gaslighting you. They're telling you your experience is not real.
Yeah.
What you're experiencing, this stagnation, this inability to get promoted, paid more, it's not real. And like you need to leave those environments because those stories are not going to help you.
Yeah. I mean, this sticking to the script and breaking out from that is a really interesting thing. And I think that is where, to our senior leaders, that you have your teams leaving. Like these are some of the things that your young people and your managers that are going through and experiencing burnout, like they're starting to ask all these questions of what is work? What does it actually mean? What value is it providing in my life? And they're not leaving because they're lazy. They're leaving because they're, for the first time, breaking from the script and grappling with this actual question, right, Paul?
People are not lazy. So like
Yeah, I
when I
mean,
quit
yeah,
my
go ahead,
job,
go
I
ahead.
wanted to escape work. And I was sort of drawn by I'll just work way less and chill by the beach and do nothing. Like it would like many people have this fantasy of like I just want to live by a beach and do nothing. I've actually gone places where people had the economic resources to do that, like in Bali and beaches in Mexico. It turns out no one actually wants that. When you give people time and space, they are drawn to contribute and be useful. We want to help people. We want to connect to ourselves. We want to do things that bring us alive. Um, Basically, we all want to like be part of something.
Yeah.
So people are only lazy when you're doing stuff that is destroying their will to keep going, right? So what burnout is, like the most common way burnout shows up as I see it is basically a disconnectedness from what matters to you. It's not long hours, like long hours will certainly burn you out in like a physical exhaustion kind of way. But like people are burning out because they're spending hours every week working on things that don't matter to them. And they're being told by people that it does matter to them. And you can only bear that so long. It doesn't matter how much you're getting paid. It doesn't matter how much status you're getting from your job. It doesn't matter how much you love other aspects of your work. You will be destroyed.
Well, I mean, so you shared this story of like in one of your first jobs in the corporate world where you're combing through boxes looking for repair work done on Amelia
Right.
Earhart's plane, and they said, oh, it's going to suck, it sucks, but it's for your resume, it's for good. And I thought you had a great line in here that said there's this thought process that you had around why the hell are so many grown-ups spending their time on obviously pointless tasks? And I think a lot of people can look at their work week and say, why are we doing this? And yet they continue to do it. And that is where people experience, to your point, that's where people experience the burnout. It's
Yeah.
not that they are tired of working. They're tired of working on things that they don't understand how it connects to a larger purpose.
Right. And this is hard. I mean, you're working in big organizations, they're naturally going to create just all sorts of tasks, right? Especially if you're in an organization that isn't growing rapidly. You're more or less working to just keep the organization going. And like maintenance tasks may not be exciting for some people. Some people like doing the monthly report over and over again. For me, like I just can't keep doing that.
Same. Same. Well, it's interesting too. I want to hear your thoughts on this from your change management
Yeah.
background, right? Like I think about it. I mean, we get hit up all the time, and this is part of my Disney background as well that we've infused into engagement, and it's like uh, around creating organizational purpose. And I think there was that run in the last couple of years where everybody's like, we got to create our purpose, and it's different than mission and vision because employees want purpose, and it's like they want purpose every day. They want to work on purposeful tasks. It's not that they want to like have a cool purpose
Yeah.
statement. Like that's not what this is about. This is about, can you connect someone's day-to-day tasks with something that matters? And that's where I think all these organizations that are trying to endlessly chase this like cool saying, they're totally missing the point.
Yeah, I mean, this is a broad issue in the business world. Basically, people copy paste catchy ideas, and it, I think people are surprised that like billion-dollar profitable organizations could be wasting their time on things, but they've defined the problem correctly. People do want purpose, but they're taking the wrong approach. They're doing it's
Yeah.
top-down culture PR. They're deciding from a top-down standpoint how things should be. Like, here's the purpose we're assigning to. Purpose is personal. Like, you can't tell somebody what their purpose is.
Right.
And we
Right. And I
we
mean, that's
also don't
go
have a
ahead.
good sense of what actually we mean by like meaningful work is one of these words that is just loaded with nonsense. We don't actually know what we want. We think we want to be happy. That's what like companies are pitching us when they propose meaningful work. And it's really attractive. Like I was attracted by that. When I first saw like Google when I was graduating college, it's like, oh, all these free meals and yoga and happy employees. It's like we think we want that. The best moments in my career were really intense, really challenging, and like really fast paced, like feedback and improvement. That's it. That's like what we want. When we reflect on the most meaningful things that happen in our life or work, it's often those like frustrating, challenging things, but we were improving and growing.
Yeah. I mean, it's where I think for, again, sports and entertainment listeners, right? From an athlete perspective, it's like the times where you felt the best is right after a really hard competition where you trained for and you worked
Yeah.
towards and you busted your tail for, and you came out of there and you were on your knees getting off the field, but you knew you gave it your all. And there was some feedback. You won, you lost, you got a score, you got a time. And that is where if that doesn't come to fruition in the workplace, you're just grazing cattle, and like nobody wants that. Like we're not programmed as that.
Yeah. And sports is such an interesting example because you look at professional athletes, especially like the NBA or something, these people have solved their money problems. Like it's gotten to the point where like people probably aren't going to end up bankrupt anymore if you make it to the NBA.
Right.
Um,
Right.
But the NBA has become filled with this idea that like you have to win a championship. Like Charles Barkley has been mocked on TV so many times that like people meme themselves into thinking this is the only thing that matters, right? And then Kevin Durant, after he wins the title with the Warriors, was like depressed, right? And like you hear other similar stories. Like if you read the details of what Andrew Luck's saying when he retired from sports, it's like the sport became like too central to his identity. And he had a hard time connecting with like what really mattered to him. Kevin Durant, like his struggle to be happy. Um, nobody's immune from these problems. Like no amount of money, fame, status, power, success is going to solve the problems of meaning and what brings us alive.
That component is really interesting too. And I think as an entrepreneur, that's been something that I've grappled
Yeah.
with over the last 4.5 years of like, and everybody, I mean, again, this is really central to all of our senior leaders listening here is like, because you work so much as an entrepreneur, as somebody in the sports and entertainment industry, like that does becomes central to your identity. And like for the first couple of years I had my company, people would ask, how are you doing it?
Right.
And my first thing is like, oh, we landed this contract and we're working with these guys. And it's like, they didn't ask how the business was doing. They asked how I was doing, how David was doing. And then, when I peeled back the onion and like started like figure it out, I'm like, there isn't a lot of depth on that personal side because I've leaned so much into the work side of things. And now I've done a lot better job, especially in like the last year with parsing that out. But like, I mean, I think about there's a quote that you had here, and maybe this is where we go into this. So like, if we don't define enough, we default to more, which makes it impossible to understand when to say no. And I think that really ties into this whole concept of like work-life balance and people wanting an identity outside of work, especially when that work is meaningless. So maybe to go into this a little bit more and your thoughts here.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting comment. I think it'd be worth diving into your comment about like people are asking you, what are you working on? How are you doing? People ask me the same thing. And one of the most interesting things to me was my entire 10 years in like consulting and even when I was in business school, not working for 2 years, nobody asked, why are you doing this? And then all of a sudden I quit my job and people are like, why are you doing this? What's your plan? Are you going to hire people? Are you succeeding? Do you have clients? And like, I also, that was also like my push to like go internal and like figure things out. I lied. I said, oh yeah, I have clients. I have this pipeline. Like, and I imagine you were experiencing similar things. The truth is I had no idea what I was doing, but I had a hunch that this was a direction worth following. And that's so hard to communicate to people. And the easiest thing to do is basically instead of defining your own principles, your own rules, your own like mindset and approach to things, you just look around at what other people are doing and kind of like copy paste the approach, right? So as an entrepreneur, you can just look at other public entrepreneurs sharing their success and think like, oh, I should get venture funding. And what you've done is short circuited that like bottom up analysis of like who is David? What brings him alive? What energizes him? Because it might take you longer to figure all that out. But as soon as you do, it's like skiing downhill. Like this is what I've found.
Right.
Even really only in like the last year do I feel like I am opting into things that I want to be doing, I'm getting paid for, and that bring me alive. But
100%.
I went through like a dip
go
of
ahead.
like not making decent money for several years because I had a hunch that like playing the long game was going to be better.
And I think again, if like for our listeners on the show, when you're trying to understand why your people are leaving, like this is some of the things is that like, I think to Paul's point, when he first jumped out, he wasn't making a ton of money. And like, that is where a lot of this generation, it's not even a generation, a lot of this group of people that is migrating from the workforce of the traditional script is, I mean, they're going into this and thinking the long game is more important. Understanding the why am I doing this is more important than sticking to that classic script. And I mean, I would agree. It took me a couple of years as well to kind of get into that flow of understanding why am I doing this work? Why is this work important? you jump out with a path of saying, oh, I think I can be successful at this. And I think maybe that the world needs this, right? And that's why you jump out of the security blanket of that every Thursday or every other Thursday paycheck. But really quickly, you start to grapple into a lot of these deeper conversations with yourself that sometimes are not easy and sometimes force you to like reevaluate a whole
Yeah.
crap load of other things that are outside of work as well. But that's ultimately where our growth as humans come from, and that's what we're looking for at the end of the day is meaning, right?
Yeah. So like I talk about this when I was experimenting with like leaning away from work in my full-time job. And I was saying like what does that actually look like? It basically looks like dropping the ball and underperforming at work and not getting the highest promotions or like highest raises, right? And this is basically what it's looked like on my own path, which is I'm not prioritizing money and success first. So what does that look like? It basically looks like not really like doing my best from like other people's perspective, which I still feel that pressure. Like I feel like an idiot sometimes. Am I stupid for turning down this project? Should I be trying to make more money? Should I be leaning harder into stuff? And I kind of just check in with myself and say, like, am I happy? Do I like what I'm doing? Do I like the people around me? Do I like my life? Yeah. Is that enough? Yeah, it is. It's hard though.
That it's hard. It's hard. I mean, because definitely like, I mean, I come from a family, like we've got 5 boys, right? My dad was an exec with Disney. And so everybody, I mean, success, there is a script for like what, at least on an outcome
Yeah.
perspective, what success looks like, right? Everybody's taken different paths in our family from that, and we're all really close, but there is an outcome of like what that looks like. And to your point, you've not only redefined the journey, you've had to sit and say, what does the outcome of success look like? And it's not only is my path going to be different, but my outcome is going to be different from the traditional mindset of what is success.
Yeah. I had a friend whose father worked in consulting and then worked in private equity for 10 years and basically like 100 cent a millionaire. And
Yeah, yeah, you do that
I
for
asked my
long
friend,
enough, you're gonna
like,
be wealthy.
do you feel like you have to like do better than your father? He's like, yeah, sort of. I'm like, damn, that sucks. Because that's really hard.
Yeah,
If you want to make like that sort of outsized return, that's is a very, I mean, athletes have this focus too. They want to make it to the elite level. It's very hard to do that. And you have to compromise so many things in your life to do that. And this is why I kind of wrote my book. Like, I'm not writing my book for the people that want to be like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or the
right.
LeBron of their industry. I'm writing it for like average people like me who couldn't seem to figure out how to make a side hustle profitable before quitting their job and like who kind of want more in their life than just work and figuring that out along the way. And it basically just means trade-offs and costs.
Yeah. Well, one thing I do want to get into here is we come into the last couple minutes here. There was a quote from your book that says, "Creative work runs on uncertainty. It runs on not knowing what you're doing." And I think you can't always provide that ROI for creative work. So kind of how do you define success in creative work? I mean, what are some of your favorite metrics to measure as you're thinking about like what does success look like? I mean, we're talking about what is success. So and redefining that. I mean, what are some of your favorite metrics for how you think about this redefined success?
It's really the conversations I have with people like this. Just the fact that I mean, I realize this is going to go to more people, but just like having this conversation with you and like that you've read my work and are excited by the ideas and like want to have these discussions and like you've found some value in it. It's really cool. And like for me that's enough. I think I've made $1,200 on my book. Um like I've sold 1,200
Glad to contribute to
I've
that.
sold 1,200 copies and I don't know how I'll do in the future. Maybe I'll make some money, but I don't think it's going to change my life. It would have been really easy to set these huge goals, but that would have just created more friction in my life, and like I would have had to really push towards those. So I'm really just trying to keep meaning and success small. Like I really
Yeah.
value the one-on-one conversations and potential friendships and just like getting to know people, finding spaces where I can like help people. And yeah, that works for me. People shouldn't copy that. They should try to figure out what works for them. And I get so pumped when people like you are building your own thing because that's probably working for you and it's probably helping a larger scale of people. Maybe at some point I'll have enough confidence to go build something at scale, but for now I'm just very like a solo player.
But even from that perspective, right? Like again, who's to say that like building something at scale is even worthwhile, right? Like, I mean, it might not be the worthwhile thing for you. And that's where I think like again, there are so many more people today redefining what does success look like. And based on your definition of success, it's going to set up your path. I mean, even for us on this show, right? Like we our best performing episodes tend to be the episodes where we have like a senior leader in sports and entertainment. And we have had a lot of episodes that we're like, why is that getting the numbers that it's getting? Like, I didn't, I didn't particularly love that episode, right? Like, I didn't particularly think that that was like a super insightful episode, and like somehow it gets a lot of plays. And sometimes it's because it's a big name. And so then you know, on our end, we grapple with like, well, what is our metric of success? What is the point in us doing this show? Is it to inspire new ideas, or is it to get a bunch of listens? Right? Is it to have people like walk away from an episode thinking, wow, I'm thinking totally different about that concept now? Or is it to just have a big name on there and get a bunch of clicks? And like we've chosen to go the route where we're like, we want to introduce new concepts to people because that to us is what defines success, not the numbers.
Yeah, I mean it's good to be like pragmatic too. Like I write publicly. Do I track subscriber numbers or have goals? No. But if it was declining by 10 every week for like several months, I'd be like, okay, maybe I should look at that. Something's happening. I
Right.
also
Right.
think podcasts are really interesting because people just subscribe and typically don't unsubscribe, right? So
Yeah.
you can be sort of pragmatic and say, okay, I'm going to try to interview LeBron James. And then the next 3 episodes are just going to be people I find fascinating, right? I'm going to try and grow the podcast, but I'm also going to make
Right.
them come along the journey with me to explore the conversations I want to have. Um, Chris Williamson of Modern Wisdom does this really well. So he'll interview
Mm.
someone like trying to think of somebody, but just like somebody really famous. And then the other episodes are just people he thinks are fascinating, who people have never heard of. And what you're doing by subscribing to that podcast is following his curiosity, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Which
and
is
he
great.
pulls you into that by saying, "Hey, I got you with this high status person, but now you're coming on my journey."
Now you're at my turn. Well, I kind of want to pivot here a little bit to, I want to make sure there's some clear takeaways for our listeners here. So we just interviewed Josh Foreman, he's taken his company and moved to a 4-day work week. And so while leaders are now, I think they've got a better understanding inside the brain of the person that is questioning, is there something better than this script that I've lived on my typical employment? Um, how I want to figure out if there's a way for leaders to start to adapt the script to maybe keep people there a little bit longer. You know, I think about Google's 80/20 rule that they used to have, where 1 day a week an employee could work on a side project, right? I mean, having worked in change management, understanding your pathless path, I mean, how would you advise organizations to maybe rewrite the script, reframe the workday, work week to encourage more of this type of creative work and keep their top talent?
Yeah, so I think the 4-day work week is really interesting. I do think it's falling into a bit of like copy paste of like thinking you're going to make workers happier. You're still pretty much signing them up for like a continuous work life where like their entire life is still centered around work. So I think This is really hard for leaders to realize because most people that are leaders of companies have built their entire life around work as the center and have like structured their life, whether they have a partner or spouse, like taking care of their family or like hired help, like they've structured their life in this way. What's happening is people are questioning these scripts and want to refactor their lives and build them up bottoms up. What that doesn't always look like is continuous work throughout the year. Often people don't want to quit their jobs. What they really want is time and space to reconnect with themselves, contemplate their place in the world and figure out what matters. So people often don't want a 4-day work week, they want a month off without the shame and stigma of not being employed.
Yeah.
I think the most interesting experiments, and it's funny, corporations are like following the 4-day work week. The most interesting organizations to follow, I think, are the ones that have been remote first for like 10 years because they're so far ahead of these other companies. And some of the founders of these companies are reaching out to me. The experiments they're doing are saying, how can we restructure our work? So one thing I do in my own work life is take every 7th week off. Like those aren't for vacations. Those are just to pause
Every
my
7th
work.
week off.
Right. So then what that does is structure my work into 6-week blocks. And I say, for these 6 weeks, what are my intentions and priorities? That doesn't mean I'm working continuously in those 6 weeks every day, nonstop. But it's like, okay, here's like a solid chunk of time where I'm going to focus. And then I disconnect from work and I wander, I explore. It could be a vacation. It doesn't have to be. Other experiments are people are trying to modularize work into saying, what are 3-month blocks I could do? So how could I stack 3-month blocks? So you work 3 months and then you can take time off. Maybe you work 3-month blocks in the year. What does that look like? Because what's happened is we shift to remote work is we're shifting from input, sitting your butt in a chair and showing up and proving to your manager that you're showing up, to output. And when you're defining it around output, you can then work backwards and chunk up the work year, the work life in different ways. So anyone intelligent who's not like actively developing skills in their work is like taking time off because they're saying, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna make it in my career if I just grind through doing accounts payable for this sports organization who won't promote me. I'm gonna take a month off and like explore developing, learning how to write and learning how to code and doing all these things because that's just the smart thing to do. So like older people think like the smartest thing you should do is just stay employed forever. That's a perfect recipe to get fired 10 years from now.
Right, right. So, I mean, as I'm thinking about it, and I hear you talking, like, is this like one of the biggest problems that organizations just haven't defined what is output? And like, I mean, we think about like a results only workplace. Like, is that where it starts? I mean, if you're a senior leader, like just sitting down and saying, before we can even think about chunking things up, before we can think about a 4-day work week or whatever, is it start with defining what is output?
Yeah, I think so. So right now there are more experiments going than ever, right? And this is really great
Which I
because
love.
people want different models. If you're leading a company, like before the pandemic, it'd be really stupid to do these experiments. One, because of the stigma, like people would be like, what the hell are you doing? That's stupid. So you would feel stupid. And two, like your rate of failure is going to go up because the proven model of like how to run a company is like, it works for a reason. It works. Right. But as individuals are saying, I'm going to refactor my work life and I may or may not join you depending on how you fit into that. It's now actually advantageous for employers to be experimenting on this because they're going to pick up some of the most creative and interesting people. I will not work full time for a company right now. I could add value to a lot of companies. I won't work full time for a company. Would I work on a short-term contract? Would I consider working 1 day a week for a company? Yes. But there just aren't interesting companies willing to experiment with that.
Yeah, and I think we'll see more and more again, especially as top talent leaves and says, "Hey, I'm going to go work and explore a different path, a different output." I think in order to get that top talent that's going to be required to succeed, I think you're going to have to start experimenting a little bit more, especially if you want to turn, just like we led the show starting off with, turning this great resignation, the this employee leaving the workplace into the great attraction. So, Paul, any final words to leave our audience with? We'll do the old Tim Ferriss question, right? If you had a billboard and you could put a piece of advice up there, what would you give to our listeners?
I don't know. Maybe I would start with the question is, what is work? Because I think really contemplating that question, I mean, for me, it led to like this 5 to 7 year journey of exploration and writing, ending up in a book. Um, at minimum, it will enable you to start looking at things differently. Where do my work beliefs come from? Where do those stories originate? Are they serving me? Is it helpful to believe that work is only coming with a paycheck? I don't know.
That's a great question to ask. Paul, anything else for our listeners? Where can people follow along your journey? Where can people reach you and message you and see what you're
Yeah,
up
so
to?
if you Google Paul Millerd, Millerd, I'm like the only one with an internet presence. Or search the Pathless Path, Paul. You can find my book. But yeah, think-boundless.com is my website. I'm pretty easy to find and always happy to talk to people about this stuff. But yeah, to the business leaders listening to this, like dream bigger. It's an exciting time. And if you're willing to question some of your own work beliefs, you might tap into engaged, inspired, creative people that want to work for you.
Love it. Paul, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. Really looking forward to our next conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, David.
Thanks to everybody tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Hey guys, before you head out, just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. That helps more of your peers find the show as they search for ways to get better in their own roles. But this podcast is just a small part of what we do at Engagement. In our normal day in the office, we're crazy focused on helping athletic departments and sports and entertainment companies generate more revenue by becoming more customer-centric. To see how we might be able to help your organization, visit engagementpartners.com to learn more. Download a free guide, check out our blogs and case studies, or schedule a call with us if you want to see how we can help with your particular objectives. Our goal is to help you create deeper connections with fans and generate more revenue. So when you're with us, hopefully you find a nugget or two that helps your cause.